کنفرانس واشنگتن. خاورمیانه در حال گذار، چشماندازها برای ایران. مقامات عالی رتبه و کلیدی در دولت‌های بوش، کلینتون و اوباما. 30 بهمن 1389، 19 فوریه 2011. بیل ریچاردسون، کاندیدای ریاست جمهوری، وزیر انرژی 1998 2001، سفیر آمریکا در ملل متحد 1997 1998، فرماندار نیومکزیکو 2003 2011، نماینده ویژه پرزیدنت اوباما در مذاکرات هسته‌ای با کره شمالی، نماینده در سازمان کشورهای آمریکایی، آمریکای مرکزی و آمریکای لاتین، عضو مجلس نمایندگان. ارتشبد مایکل هیدن، رئیس اطلاعات مرکزی آمریکا 2006 2009، معاون ریاست کل آژانس‌های اطلاعاتی آمریکا 2005 2006، رئیس آژانس امنیت ملی آمریکا 1999 2005. مایکل موکیزی، وزیر دادگستری آمریکا 2007 2009، ریاست دادگاه، قاضی فدرال. سفیر دل دیلی، مسئول بخش تروریسم در وزارت خارجه آمریکا 2007 2009. والتر اسلوکومب، معاون وزیر دفاع آمریکا 1994 2001.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Bill Richardson has just concluded his second term as the governor of New Mexico. But that's only part of his story. Nearly 29 years ago, we were elected together to the House of Representatives. Starting in 1997, Governor Richardson held two posts in the Clinton administration. First as ambassador to the United Nations, where he served with great distinction, and then as Secretary of Energy. He was a presidential candidate in 2008 for the Democratic Party, has become one of the great voices in our country and in my party for all things good and decent, a good friend, Bill Richardson.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. You know, I want to just say, with Bob Torricelli, Congressman Bob Torricelli, Senator Torricelli, those of us in the Congress used to call him the Torch. That's how he was known, because he was an unflagging fighter for human rights and democracy. And I wanted to just say to you how honored I am to be with this bipartisan group of leaders. You know, we're all members, I suspect, of a political party, a point of view, but when you attack an issue of human rights and national security, it's so much better to do it in a bipartisan way. And I think all you have to look is on the right and the left, the distinguished leaders that are, I think, fairly together on this issue. It shows the importance of what we're talking about here today. Here's why I'm optimistic. First, the events in the Middle East. Whatever you may think of what's happened there, obviously, it's a thirst for freedom and democracy. It's an effort to topple dictators that curb the expression of the press and of the people. Is it a technological revolution? Yeah. The technology of communicating among people, not just within Egypt, But within the Middle East, you saw the connection of the young people of Tunis and Egypt. And you sense that with this powerful technological tool, that has fueled the dissent that has brought the end of regimes. And you see it in Bahrain, although there's some sectarian issues. You see it in other countries in the Middle East. And you see it in Iran. And I, too, like the ambassador and the senator said, I am pleased with my government's response. We have to collaborate with Middle East countries in the fight against terrorism. There's so many security interests that we have to deal with, but that when it comes to security, when there comes to issues of freedom and democracy, you have to strike a balance. But eventually you got to pick one over the other. I think we have a bipartisan consensus that freedom and democracy are the values that we should stand for more than anything as Americans. And so this is why I feel that this movement, maybe our movement, what has happened in the Middle East, means that the movement that I believe we share has what is called momentum. And you can sense it in a political campaign. I'm one of those that has run a campaign, Lee Hamilton. And by the way, it's great to see Lee Hamilton. When I was a congressman, everyone said, if you want to know what's happening in the Middle East, listen to Lee Hamilton. So I'm going to listen to Lee when he speaks. And so I sense this momentum with what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening in Iran, you know, the repressive nature of the regime responding to the protesters. But you can see something hopefully happening soon. So I'm pleased with that. The Istanbul talks showed that the Iranian regime is not interested in negotiating. I mean, they set preconditions that made the talks sponsored by the European Union literally absurd. And so there's no reason to pursue what is called the dialogue for now, when they basically say that they want to take the issue of enriching uranium off the table, so you can't even discuss what you're going to negotiate. So, again, that I see it as pointing to our policymakers that the negotiations have not worked. The events in the Middle East show momentum. So let me get to my final point. As I see, there are three issues that have to be dealt with. First, the delisting. I mean, it makes no sense to have these delisting. It makes no sense at all. On grounds of evidence, the Court of Appeals, and I understand the lawyer, your lawyer is here, who did that masterful brief. The D.C. Court of Appeals has said that the justification for the terrorism designation lacks due process. And so the first step has to be the delisting. And that's where I hope we can all work together and make this happen soon. Soon. Thank you. Number two, and here's another bit of the good news. You know, you're probably wondering, when all these heavyweights say we should delist and we should do something about Camp Ashraf. I saw a huge European Union commitment to this issue. So I'm not saying be patient. I'm saying keep doing what you're doing, but let's do it more strategically. And I think the argument that is made is this is a movement that doesn't want any money. This is a movement that doesn't want weapons. This is a movement that just wants to be allowed to roam, to do your democratic thing. Have you ever heard of a movement that doesn't ask for money? I haven't. You're the first. So my two other Camp Ashraf. I mean, that again, that's a human rights issue. That is just a matter of security, of moving the right people to secure this camp. Our people work with the government of Iraq to make it happen with the United Nations. You know, find a formula that provides a safety and security for many of those that are in your families. Things are going our way. You know, the Middle East situation, the Istanbul talks, Secretary Clinton's great speech in Iran, more people knowing about this issue. And so it has to end up working well. So I'm delighted to be here, and I'm very pleased to be associated with many of you. It's great to see my colleagues here.
General Michael Hayden was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, appointed by President George W. Bush. He served from 2006 to 2009. Prior to becoming CIA director, he was the principal deputy director of National Intelligence. General Hayden was director, National Security Agency, from 1999 to 2005. And since then has served as commander of the Air Intelligence Agency and as director of the Joint Command and Control Warfare Center. General, we're honored to have you this morning.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator, and thank all of you for giving me the opportunity to be with you here this morning and this afternoon. A distinguished gathering of decision makers and policy makers here, and I'm the intel guy. And so I think I'm going to come at this discussion from the point of view of the intel guy, because that's who I am. And before I jump into the specifics, I need to give you a sense as to what it is I think that means, that I'm coming at this question as the intelligence guy. Intelligence works at the nexus of the world as it is and the world as we want it to be. And intelligence takes a pretty powerful role in those decision-making processes, but it's a peculiar role. You get into the same room that these distinguished gentlemen are in, but you come in through an entirely different door. Now, inherently, if I'm the fat guy talking to the vision guy, and the governor suggested this earlier, that vision guy is inherently optimistic. Otherwise, he wouldn't have applied for that job if he didn't think he could affect change. The intel guy never gets to set policy, but his responsibility should be to set the left and the right-hand boundaries of what constitutes the possible. Now, I have to tell you, I participated in that kind of dialogue about Iran multiple times in the Oval Office with President Bush and his team. And in fact, I would offer you the view that Iran, behind al-Qaeda, Iran was the second most discussed topic that we had during my time in government. President Bush had hundreds of questions about Iran that I would divide into two general baskets. One would be about the nuclear program, kind of the specifics of the physics there. And the other had to do with Iran itself and how it was governed, and particularly how the Iranian government made decisions. And I must tell you, as tough as those nuclear questions were, those were the ones I wanted. I would say, too, that the President Bush, and I felt as if I had a very good relationship with him, he actually offered some impatience when it came to Iran and how much insight we could give him. I recall one incident when he said, "Mike, this isn't North Korea. It's not a closed society. We have some access. How come this is so opaque for us?" And in another instance, again, I had a good relationship with the president. In another instance, he was kind of poking his finger at the middle of my chest, saying, "Mike, I don't ever want to be faced, Mike, I don't want any president ever to be faced with only two options. Okay? Accepting a nuclear-armed Iran or conducting major military activity against that state. So now I step back and I'm wondering, what are the fat guys, the guys that I left behind in my profession, what are the fat guys now telling the vision guys in our government with regard to these questions? I think the first thing they're telling them is, as has been mentioned several times before, Iran is on a path to nuclear capability. And I was quite struck with Chairman Hamilton's incredibly careful choice of words. He didn't quite say weapon, he said nuclear capability, and that's kind of where I am too. And in my personal view, if this is a weapon, I think the Iranians get right there. We got a kit in the garage, and we can put this thing together in a couple weeks, because having a weapon, and particularly testing a weapon, sets in motion a whole bunch of things that they don't want, and frankly, that they don't need. Now, how do you know they're that close? When my successor, be it Leon Panetta or someone else, goes into the president and says, Mr. President, they're so close, I can no longer tell you when it is they will actually have one. There's public commentary on the new national intelligence estimate that's coming out. I've not seen the document. I only know what I read in the paper, but it is the language that seems to be reflected in the press accounts parallels what I've just said. They're using the phrase virtual nuclear weapon, or my phrase now, permanent breakout. Okay? I think that's a reality. Now, that's really important, because let me give you a second truth I think the fat guys should be given to the vision guys. The second truth is there is the very real possibility that this government in Iran, the one we're talking about now, the one that, about whose legitimacy we all have serious doubts, that this government is actually incapable of stopping that trajectory. Okay? Hear me out. Recall right after the Obama administration came in, we offered the Iranian government an arrangement by which they could take the LEU from Natanz, give it to a second or third party, change it into medical isotopes, and return it to Iran. And by the way, that deal had nothing to do with stopping the centrifuges spinning in Natanz, which used to be the American red line. I mean, we had, just to summarize, we had moved our red line dramatically, had not challenged their right to spin centrifuges, in fact, implicitly accept their right to have uranium enriched at 20%. And do you recall they accepted the offer before they didn't? They were unable to pick up what was, I think, by any objective measure, a powerful concession. They were unable, because of whatever processes or dynamics inside that government, to say yes, even when it was, I think, in their own interest. We saw this play out 3 octaves below this. If you recall the 3 American hikers that are still indicted, 2 of them still in custody. Did you see the drama for the young lady? Yes, we're going to release her. No, we're not. She has to pay a fine. No, she doesn't. She's got to come back. How about bail? And then all of a sudden, she shows up in Oman. Okay? That's not rocket science, that decision. And look at the dysfunction in trying to get there. I think President Obama even recognizes this. As we ratchet up the last set of sanctions, which are indeed quite dramatic, he had a press availability with a bunch of thinkers on this subject, and the president is explicitly quoted by name as saying, the Iranian regime may be so ideologically committed to getting a weapon that no amount of pressure can dissuade them. That has tremendous policy implications if our goal is to shape regime thinking. If our premise is we can make this problem be solved by affecting how they think, affect how they think by engagement, affect how they think by sanctions. If you accept the premise I've just offered you, they're incapable of getting to yes, that makes all of that pretty much wasted effort. A third truism, I think the fat guys should be telling the vision guys. Regime behaviors and a whole bunch of other areas give us little hope for a changed relationship with this group. Now, it's mentioned already, well-known support for Syria, for Hezbollah, for Hamas. General Shelton mentioned some of the things that they had been doing in Iraq. How about this sentence? This is one that I formed when I was DCIA, when we were talking about the darkest days in Iraq with EFPs. Recall the improvised explosive devices that were manufactured and designed by the Iranian regime. It was the policy of the Iranian government, approved at the highest levels of that government, to facilitate the killing of American and coalition soldiers in Iraq, period. It doesn't get as stark, it doesn't get any more stark than that in talking about any regime's behavior. I was often asking government that if the Iranians get a weapon, could we deter their using it? Again, kind of accepting what some folks may fear is the inevitable. And I must admit, I was struck by the question, can we deter the Iranians from using that weapon? Because I frankly think, and again, fact guy talking to vision guy, I frankly think if you're talking about deterrence here and an Iranian weapon, we're not talking about deterring Iran. We're talking about Iran deterring us. Picture what an Iranian regime without a nuclear weapon is now doing. And then imagine what might such a regime with a weapon, even if it's a kit in the garage, as I suggested, might be capable of doing. Which brings us to the fourth truism: how do we deal with the current events? How brittle is this regime? And the first thing I need to offer, these are not dominoes, these are very different regimes. Okay? And so one has to be a bit sophisticated to see how events as they happened in Tunisia or how they happened in Egypt or how they are happening in Yemen, how they play out in Iran. There are many common denominators. A youth bulge, disaffected youth, a pretty well-connected youth. Okay? Certainly dissatisfaction with the regime, but has already been suggested by several folks up here. This is also a regime that will shoot its own citizens, which makes it quite different than Tunisia and Egypt. They are quite willing to use maximum force. This makes this a very, very difficult problem for our policymakers. Success, even if we put our full energy to this, is not something that's inevitable or guaranteed. And frankly, I understand a bit of the reluctance of the administration, because we shared it in the previous administration, to touch this, because the degree to which there are American fingerprints on it, it might make it more difficult for those folks we all know will ultimately resolve this, the Iranian people, to resolve it. But frankly, our comments have been a bit cautious. Our comments to date have been about process, not about change. If you compare our comments now about Iran, it's about Iranian behavior towards the demonstrators. It's not about transition, meaningful transition now, which frankly was the language we used just 10 to 14 days ago. That then must lead to some very real questions. If a nuclear Iran is unacceptable, and there are 3 successive American presidents who have said that is unacceptable, if it is unacceptable, if Iranian decision-making is unable to stop this process, if the opportunity for regime transformation is allowed to pass, then in 2012 or 2013 or 2014 or 2015, we do get to that fork in the road that President Bush warned me about. And who's ever president at that point has only 2 choices: do something or do nothing. And at that point, those are both very bad. Thank you all very much for the opportunity to speak.
One of the most distinguished careers in American justice has been held by Judge McKasey. Michael McKasey as the 81st Attorney General of the United States. We served until January 2009. Judge Mukasey was appointed to the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York, which next to the New Jersey court is the most distinguished court in America. For the last 6 years, he served as chief judge of that court. We all watched his skill and temperament. Judge Mukasey.
I want to thank Senator Torricelli, or the Torch, if I may call him that, for that kind introduction, and the Iranian-American community of Northern California, Neil Livingston and Executive Action for organizing this wonderful conference. And it's a pleasure to be one of the building blocks toward Lee Hamilton. In both December and January at conferences in the United States and abroad, I had occasion to point out that we were at one of those moments in history when we know that future generations are going to ask what it is we did to advance what is good and what it is we did to resist what is evil. Well, events have a way of overtaking even the most urgent rhetoric. And if anything, in the brief span of a couple of weeks, the conditions that we're here to address have become even more urgent. As before, militant Islamism threatens to destroy civilization as we know it, and at the very center of that threat is the regime that's now in control in Iran, which oppresses its own people, threatens its neighbors and the world at large, and pursues a program to develop nuclear weapons that it has said repeatedly that it will not hesitate to use. But what is new is that in parts of the Islamic world, in Tunisia and in Egypt, and most recently in Bahrain, people, mostly young people, but really the population at large, have risen and demanded freedom. And in Tunisia and in Egypt, they actually succeeded in overthrowing regimes that by any measure were authoritarian. But those regimes had limits to the brutality that they would use to survive, and so they are gone. However, in countries where there is no limit to the brutality that the regime will use to put down dissent, and Iran tops the list of those countries, the story thus far has not been as happy. The week before last, at Friday prayers, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, speaking not in Farsi, but in Arabic, just to make sure that he was reached and understood by people in Cairo, praised what he called the explosion of sacred anger and warned against United States interference in Egypt. He claims that events in Tahrir Square were the natural extension of the 1979 revolution. He was obviously not embarrassed that in 2009 he himself had given orders to put down the uprising in the streets of Tehran in response to a fraudulent election. And this week again, the regime has responded with brute force. Ahmadinejad told a crowd in Tehran's Freedom Square after the fall of Mubarak that despite all of the complicated and satanic designs of the United States, a new Middle East is emerging without the Zionist regime and U.S. interference, a place where the arrogant powers will have no place. Those are his words. Parliamentary Speaker Ali Larijani told the state-run television on February 14 that, quote, Americans have changed their stances several times in the past 20 days. First, they were doubtful to take a stance. When the protests intensified, the Americans turned to the people and began supporting them. It is precisely for this reason that Tehran did not and would not allow anti-government demonstrations to intensify in Iran. The Iranian rulers are fearful that the United States would start siding with the organized Iranian opposition that would further intensify and empower it. The United States must not, this time, wait for the outcome of the demonstrations before it decides which side it wants to be on, especially since we witnessed the great potential for change in Iran in the summer of 2009. Even before Iranians went into the streets, the mullahs executed people in record numbers and called for the execution of anyone who dissents. In particular, the mullahs have executed several members of Iran's main opposition, the MEK, who were involved in last year's anti-government demonstrations in Tehran and had relatives at Camp Ashraf, where MEK residents are holding out despite the efforts of Iran and its collaborators among the Iraqi authorities to drive the residents back to Iran or to destroy them altogether. When people were nonetheless brave enough to take to the streets again this week, the regime cut the ties between the protesters and the outside world by cutting off the Internet so that the regime could use brutality without being seen. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton expressed support for the tens of thousands of protesters in Iran's capital this week. She said that the Obama administration very clearly and directly supports the aspirations of the people who are in the streets of Tehran. She also spoke of the hypocrisy of the Iranian regime, which had hailed the protests in Egypt but suppressed opposition at home. Well, we need to overcome our own hypocrisy inherent in our policy regarding the Iranian opposition. The State Department maintains the MEK on the list of terrorist organizations. That has the effect of pushing Iran's largest and most organized opposition group, which is feared by the ruling mullahs, out of the political debate. The Iranian regime is now in the enviable position of having the United States designate as a terrorist organization a group of Iranians who are a threat to the regime, thus limiting their activities. As a result, in essence, for the past 14 years, the bulk of the resources of the group has been consumed not in fighting the Iranian regime, but in fighting the consequences of the terrorist designation to get itself delisted. In other words, the Iranian regime now has the great Satan working for it, even as the Iranian people are in the streets demanding regime change. As you are aware, the approximately 3,400 members of MEK who now live at Ashraf in Iraq, close to the border of Iran, are in a precarious position. In 2003, they surrendered the weapons that they had to defend themselves in return for a solemn guarantee from the deputy commander of multinational forces in Iraq that they would be treated as protected persons under the Fourth Geneva Convention. From 2003 to 2009, the United States honored and backed up that solemn commitment, and General Petraeus did not turn over responsibility for security to Iraqi forces until he received an assurance that the residents of Ashraf would continue to be protected. But Iran has brought increasing pressure on the Iraqi government within the past several months, and the situation for the residents of Camp Ashraf has grown ever more perilous. Iranian Quds forces, either ignored or actually actively supported by Iraqi forces, have attacked and harassed residents of Ashraf, and as you've heard, they've placed at the gates of the camp some 180 loudspeakers that go 24 hours a day to harass the residents day and night, prevent them from sleeping. This psychological pressure has been ongoing for almost a year. Medical care, as you've heard, continues to be denied to residents of Ashraf. We speak of and recognize the dangers of Islamism, but real change in that is unlikely to come from outside the Islamic world. However, MEK is a moderate Islamic organization committed to establishing a secular, democratic, and nuclear-free Iran. But instead of help and encouragement to MEK, the United States instead lists MEK as a foreign terrorist organization. This is not a partisan issue, as between Republicans and Democrats. The history goes back to the 1990s, during the Clinton administration, when, as you heard, MEK was designated by the Secretary of State as a terrorist organization in the belief that that would somehow help us engage with the mullahs. That worked. It continued, regrettably, in the administration in which I served, in the belief that if we delisted MEK, the Iranians would send IEDs and other equipment to insurgents in Iraq, which, of course, they were doing anyway. There's an opportunity to change that dynamic immediately and dramatically by removing the designation of MEK immediately. This would have three effects. First, it would show the current regime that we mean business and that we're prepared to take all necessary steps to bring pressure on it. Second, it would send a strong signal to the Iranian people that United States policy is genuinely to side with them, with those who are standing up against the regime, which would further fuel dissent against the regime in Iran. And third, it would take the focus of the attention of the regime away from Hezbollah in Lebanon and away from the fluid situation in Egypt and make them focus on their own borders. With Tehran trying to exploit the situation in Egypt and in other countries in the Middle East and speeding up its nuclear weapons program, America should empower the main Iranian opposition as the Iranian people are preparing for further anti-government demonstrations. There are simply no good reasons for continuing to brand as terrorists a group of people who, so far as anyone can tell, are interested only in bringing to their country the blessings of the kind of liberty that we enjoy in this country. And as I said, the continued designation of MEK as a terrorist organization gives great comfort to the Iranian regime by putting on the sidelines an organization that is potentially a grave threat to that regime. It also provides justification for the regime to execute MEK members in Iran and to boast that in doing so it is executing terrorists. What is to be done? Well, there's a growing consensus inside this country and outside it of the need to delist MEK. An increasing number of members of Congress have supported a resolution favoring that result, and that shows the degree of consensus in this country. It is a bipartisan consensus. There's a case pending, as you heard, in the District of Columbia Circuit. But in a sense, this is about more than a case in the District of Columbia, and really about more than MEK. This is about the posture of the United States toward the Iranian regime. I think the case has been made that when Iranians go into the street and put their lives on the line for freedom, as they are doing now, and as they did after the fraudulent election in 2009, our response, through those in our government who speak for us, must be more than to remind the mullahs, as we did in 2009, that the world is watching. What is necessary is to make it clear in word and deed that we offer more than condolences when things go wrong to people who are willing to put their lives on the line for freedom. We must offer support and encouragement, and we must make it clear in word and deed to the Iranian regime that we stand with those who stand for freedom and demand regime change. I thank you again for the great privilege of speaking to you.
Ambassador Del Daly. Ambassador Daly was the Department of State's coordinator for counterterrorism from 2007 through April 2009. As the principal advisor to the Secretary of State on international counterterrorism matters, to defeat terrorists abroad, and securing the cooperation of international partners to that end. In that capacity, he also coordinated diplomats, intelligence officials, and militaries in the world's largest global counterterrorism effort. Ambassador Daly.
It's a distinct pleasure being here in Washington, engaged in a dialogue with such prominent public leaders on such an important international, regional, and distinctly U.S. issue. It's a pleasure to have worked with so many of the political, military, and government leaders here today. Timing of this conference is flawless. The conditions, quote, changed significantly, unquote, at Ashraf and the Middle East. Reasons to clearly justify the revocation. But in the Middle East especially, tick-tock, Tunisia. Tick-tock, Egypt. Tick-tock, Iran. Our presence here today is also foreboding because time is of the essence. This is best evidenced by the 3,400 men and women located at Camp Ashraf and their future vulnerability. This vulnerability is a function of the United States and coalition members' progress in normalizing their relations with the new post-Saddam Hussein nation of Iraq. But increased sovereignty of Iraq at the expense of the residents in Camp Ashraf must not occur. The regional actors, European Union, United Nations, United States, need to maintain pressure on the Iraq government to treat the Camp Ashraf members with dignity, care, restraint, and respect. An important area of concern is the humanitarian conditions at the camp. They are becoming abhorrent and must be improved. The repeated incursions by the Iraq police have occurred on numerous dates: July 2009, October 2010, November 2010, January 2011, February 2011, all resulting in injuries and several in deaths. What is even more unacceptable are the restraints placed on the residents at Camp Ashraf for obtaining medical care. For example, limiting specialist doctor care and being denied hospital access in selected cases. Couple that with the continuous blaring of propaganda into the camp from over 180 loudspeakers creates conditions that are physically unlivable. These humanitarian attacks need to be stopped and not repeated. Iran has shown a hatred for the camp and its residents, so recent as hanging of a visitor to Camp Ashraf. For Iraq and the United States, members of Camp Ashraf and the PMOI are the best counterbalance to Iranian terrorist and nuclear aggression. As a global terrorist state supporting terror in Afghanistan, all over the Middle East, and now rapidly becoming a nuclear threat and power, Iran must be met and stopped. PMOI has the contacts, the insights, cultural awareness, and a proven past record of providing the United States and hence the world with previously unknown information about Iran. No other internal or external organization has been this productive in obtaining such information. The use of the Iran opposition through the PMOI is a powerful counterbalance to Iran and has already shown its success. This opposition is an important target of Iran, of the Iran mullahs, so much so that it continues to hunt ruthlessly in Iran the PMOI connections, and possibly in Iraq. The PMOI and the Iran opposition are the best instruments of power to get inside the Iran mullahs and undo them. No one expected an uprising in Tunisia, or Egypt, or Libya, or Bahrain, or Yemen, but surprisingly it happened. The people of Iran, with a recent history of throwing off the rulers from 1979 to last year, can respond. My second point is the revocation of the PMOI from the U.S. Foreign Terrorist Organization list. Our allies, both the European Union and the United Kingdom, have removed the PMOI from their comparable lists. It should be revoked. It is appropriate that Secretary of State Clinton fix this gross embarrassment and obviously painful error as soon as possible. Finally, and most importantly, the conditions for retaining the PMOI on the list have, quote, changed significantly, unquote, to warrant revocation. These conditions are very clear. The rising nuclear power of Iran, as evidenced by Iranian intransigence, arrogance, refusing to negotiate at the Istanbul talks last month. If there ever was a time for Secretary Clinton to reconsider the revocation, it is now. All our tools of persuasion and coercing of Iran have failed. Iran has a fear of the PMOI due to its popularity and its secular nature. They have a fear of the PMY due to its encouragement of free elections and rule of law. Iran has a fear of the PMY due to freedom of religion and no nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction. Iran has a fear of the PMY due to freedom of speech and freedom of press. Right now, Iran fears the PMY more than ever. A possible Tunisia, Egypt, or Iran uprising with the PMOI rising to power through legitimate efforts is absolutely a fear of Iran. It is with complete irony and embarrassment and great international confusion that the United States and Iran are of equal mind and on the same team of retaining the PMOI on the terrorist list. Let's end this confusion. We must revoke the terrorist designation. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Ambassador, very much. Walter Slocum served as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy from 1994 to 2001, and in 2003 as Senior Advisor for National Defense in the Coalition of Provisional Authority in Iraq. In 2004, President Bush appointed him to the Commission on Intelligence Capabilities of the United States regarding weapons of mass destruction. He is a lawyer, but like many of us, has tried to spend his legal career. He joined the National Security Council in 1969 and is a four-time recipient of the Award for Distinguished Public Service and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Welcome.
Well, it is certainly an occasion to say how much I appreciate the opportunity to be here with this distinguished panel, and for the reasons that a number of people, particularly Lee Hamilton, have addressed. For Iran to have a nuclear weapons capability is a very serious threat to our cold-blooded interests. Sanctions have some hope, but for a variety of reasons, they are at best a long shot. So it follows almost by a logical process of elimination that if, as General Hayden says, and I think he's probably right, this regime is incapable of abandoning its nuclear weapons ambitions voluntarily, something has to change inside Iran for their policies and their practices with respect to nuclear weapons to change. And the best thing for that is a change which is produced by the people of Iran. That means it has to happen from inside Iran. But while the United States can't lead, it must, as I think it was Governor Richardson said, it has to be on the right side and show that it's on the right side. So I think the military option, although it can't be off the table, has to be something we'd be prepared to be serious about. It means that somehow we have to find a way to change the policy of the people who run Iran. And the best chance for that is by internal change. I certainly cannot say how that internal change will come about. I think there are strong pressures for it to change. It may not take the form that it takes in other countries, but I think it is essential that it should happen. I think I want to address briefly the two specific issues of the delisting and Camp Ashraf. I may have the distinction of being the only person on the dais who's actually been to Camp Ashraf. Quite apart from the nature of the MEK, the United States has made a commitment to the protection of the people who are there. Somehow we have to find a way to ensure that those people are protected and that that commitment is made. Second, I believe that the United States is a system in which legal standards should be applied based on the facts. It is a question of fact. Does the MEK meet the standard for being on the terrorist list or does it not? I do not have access to all the information. I do have a high confidence that the people who make that decision in the State Department now, and it will ultimately be the Secretary, will approach it from the point of view of what are the facts. And I believe that if they do that, justice will be served. Thank you.
Walter, thank you for those very thoughtful remarks. I thought about a lot of things listening to this program today, and I leave you this morning just with a couple observations. Our times seem so complex, but actually some things are so simple. The one inevitability of the human species in the time in which you live is freedom. It is roaring at you, and nothing on earth will stop it. The end of the regime in Tehran is already sealed. We just don't know when. The heroes that will take them down are probably only known to themselves. But they're out there on the streets or in universities, or as we speak, meeting in basements across Iran. Some things never get held back. Human freedom. The Persian people have been a great people through all the human experience. This nightmare is almost over. Thank you all.